Hi, so I'm going to read a little bit from my blog. I'm trying to do some live streaming, but it's very difficult to do this all alone without any kind of technical crew. I'm using a MacBook Air, and I have a USB microphone here. I hope it works. I'm not sure if anybody's going to see this, but I thought I would just try. I have to keep up with the technology. So I'm reading a blog post that I wrote the other day about Nazis. It's called Nazis Are Not Funny. My father was a Reformed Jew. In fact, he was so Reformed he was a Nazi. Woody Allen said that. But we don't really think Nazis are very funny. At least I don't. Most of you are probably not old enough to remember this, but there was a TV show back in the 1960s called Hogan's Heroes. It was a story of American soldiers and French resistance fighters who ran a covert resistance operation out of a prison camp behind German lines. So the concentration camp officer was Colonel Klink, and he was played by Werner Klemperer. Werner Klemperer. He used to lampoon the idea of a cultivated German officer with a monocle and a cigarette, all that. Probably was really established by Erich von Stroheim back in the old days of silent movies. But anyways, Werner Klemperer is an interesting character because his father was a great conductor. And he played the cultivated German officer, although he was actually a Jew. Bob Crane and ex-drummer and DJ was Hogan, and every week a crew of brilliant comedians would skewer the foibles of the Germans, especially Colonel Klink, who always was the butt of the joke. His lovable sidekick was Sergeant Schultz, whose big laugh line was, "I know nothing, nothing." And the show was hilarious. Every week my brothers and I would gather around the TV for a new episode. Even my mother watched the show with us. It turned out she had a sentimental connection with the crew of Hogan's Heroes. She knew Bob Crane, but more to the point, she knew LeBeau, who was the stereotypical French guy. He was really the talented French song and dance man, Robert Clary. And my mother had known him back in the day when my father ran a nightclub on the Sunset Strip. Robert Clary would come in and sing and dance and fart around with Leslie Caron and Gene Kelly. And my mother had actually dated him back in the 1950s, so she was fascinated to see him on the TV program. And Robert Clary was kind of a short guy. He could do a brilliant Jerry Lewis impression. Hogan's Heroes was hysterical. It was really a funny show. And this wasn't because the Nazis are funny by themselves, but the show made fun of the Nazis and their just following orders mentality. Nazis are not funny. My father was working in network TV at the time. He was an executive producer on Batman and a lot of other shows. He never watched Hogan's Heroes with us because he'd been in the French Navy, where he saw action at Dunkirk. His show business career started during the war when he made propaganda broadcasts for the BBC after the French Navy had been destroyed by the Germans at Dunkirk. And Dunkirk was no laughing matter. When the armies of the Germans, who were controlled by the political views of the Nazis, swept through the neutral country of Belgium, The French Navy was stranded on the beach, along with some 300,000 or so English soldiers. My father was not among those saved by the brave fishing schooners of Operation Dynamo. He was captured on the beach and held prisoner at a concentration camp. Not a death camp, but a concentration camp where they concentrated people for being processed later. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and kind of a primitive barrier. So one day when the prisoners were allowed a game of football, my father and his friend René ran down the beach chasing the ball into the weeds and the barbed wire, and with the help of René, Alain jumped the barbed wire. And in the chaos of the football game, he wasn't really missed. By that time, they hadn't perfected the computerized head count that they would have later. So he managed to escape to England on a fishing boat run by the Free French Resistance, who were just getting started at that time. Later they would become the Maquisards. But he never watched Hogan's Heroes with us. For my father, the Nazis were not funny. In a recent competition for the funniest commercial in Europe, one of the judges commented that many of the German commercials were somehow flat. There's a stereotype about the Germans that they're just not funny. They have no sense of humor. And it's an interesting point. It may be true. I can't really think of any funny Germans off the top of my head. I can think of a lot of great Jewish comedians, but the lack of sense of humor may have something to do with the fact that during the Second World War, the funny people were either killed, deported, or exiled. And I understand that some people have an axe to grind about the Rothschilds and the bankers and so on, but I think I could make a pretty good case that the funniest people in the world are Jewish. I'm not a Jew, I'm a Hare Krishna, and effectively I was baptized Catholic, but I have great sympathy for oppressed people who have faced difficult situations in the world. And if you think about funny people, there's the Marx Brothers, arguably the funniest. Without, having to look it up on Google, I could name a few funny writers of the 20th century. Carl Reiner, Mel Brooks, Woody Allen, Neil Simon. They're all Jewish. They wrote for the Sid Caesar Show. They wrote for Johnny Carson, later for movies, Broadway plays. Funny people like Jackie Mason, Mort Saul, Lenny Bruce, and Billy Crystal practically invented stand-up comedy, and they were all Jewish. But it's interesting to remember, and I think we should remember, that during the Second World War, numerous composers, artists, musicians, thinkers, scientists, philosophers, intellectuals, and funny people were rounded up for extermination by the Nazis. Based on Hitler's racial theories, the Nazis had a 4-point program for Jews: registration, deportation, concentration, and extermination. They rendered into soap the greatest composers and poets of their day. Maybe somewhere along the line they lost their sense of humor. What they didn't think about was the impact over generations of what they'd done. It wasn't funny at all. Maybe if they hadn't deported and exterminated an entire generation of funny people, the Germans would have a better sense of humor today. But be that as it may, German commercials today are just not funny. They have little sense of humor because they gassed the funny people and made them into bars of soap. So today we have a neo-Nazi movement going on, and I don't really think it's funny. I don't think you can satirize these people, because every time you satirize them and make parodies of the Ku Klux Klan, what you're doing is you're giving these people free publicity. And Nazis are not funny. The Ku Klux Klan is not a joke. Guys marching with tiki torches and swastikas, screaming racist and anti-Semitic slogans are not funny. And I think it's time to take these people seriously. But one of the problems we have is the lack of history. That's why I'm talking about this right now just to remind people, because while the Nazi extermination of the Jews didn't happen in my lifetime, it happened in my father's lifetime, and he was scarred by that. But young people today, they lack the tools to see this point. They have no sense of history. And we have television, which shows us what's going on from moment to moment. But it seems like the purpose of television is to make us to forget things. It's not really to educate. Television has this capacity to lull us into a false sense of security. And hypnotized by the screen in front of them, we forget the past and we lose consciousness about the future. So we think technology is wonderful, but if you think about it, the most wonderful thing is not the cell phone in your hand. The most wonderful thing is the fact that everyone is going to die, but nobody believes that he is going to die. So if we reflect on the temporality of the human condition, if we reflect on the fact that death is imminent, maybe we'd change our behavior and think about the fact that actions have consequences. Advertising teaches us to believe that we're eternally young and that we can have sex, drugs, and rock and roll forever and nothing will happen. This encourages a certain lack of compassion in our consumer society, and we might consider that compassion is an important value. Violence and racism go against compassion. Violence and racism sin against compassion. The law of karma, action and reaction, means that our sins will certainly follow us after our death. And so actions have consequences. In a civilized society, there's real no place for hedonism and selfishness. We should learn to take care of those less fortunate than we are. But hypnotized by handheld screens and caught up in a web of social networks, young people are easy prey to the consumer society. It demands that they forget the past and disregard the future and just concentrate on the immediate sensual pleasure of now. So I just thought I'd take a moment to remind viewers that in a place where only immediate pleasure is valued, it's easy to forget what the Nazis stand for and what the Nazis stood for and what the Nazis did. And those who remember history are naturally nervous about Nazism and white superiority and white nationalism and racism. These are not innocent concepts. These are very dangerous concepts. And people who are nervous about Nazism don't think that Nazis are funny. My father was not a Jew, but since the Nazi-led German soldiers branded his arm with the name and number of his prison registration, he didn't think the Nazis were funny either. Modern-day Nazis are very clever, especially in the United States. They don't begin by calling for the extermination of a race. They begin with ridicule and mockery. They begin by ridiculing immigrants and people who have different beliefs or different skin colors. In the United States, they begin with the terrorists. Then they go after the Muslims. And after the Muslims and the terrorists, it's the Mexicans. And after the Muslims and terrorists and Mexicans, pretty soon they focus on inner-city crime, the drug war, welfare mothers, and juvenile delinquents. And then it's on to the black people. And then the Catholics. So, as a member of a minority point of view, I'm a Hare Krishna devotee. I've seen our members thrown in prison in Turkey by Muslims there, in Iran during Sharia law, in the Soviet Union during the time of the communists. Hare Krishna devotees were considered to be deviants and imprisoned. Even today with Vladimir Putin, since he's promoting the Orthodox Russian Church, the Hare Krishna devotees are a minority, and find themselves imprisoned. So I have some sympathy for minorities. Once you start pushing the whole idea of law and order, what happens is the war on crime tends to focus on people of color and ends in racial discrimination, or at least it helps the ideology of racial discrimination. So what happens is then organizations that are formed to protect the rights of minorities are singled out for attack. And in the end, it becomes clear that the same power structure is going after minority religions, people of color, immigrants, foreigners, and Jews. And once the tide has been turned, and it's easy to go after minorities, well, the Jews become an easy target as well. And all this erosion of personal liberty and rights seem to be rationalized by the need for national security. So people are kept in a constant state of panic and terror and emergencies to frighten ordinary citizens. And then after that, an enemy is identified who is other than us. And then that identified enemy becomes the focus of racial attacks, religious attacks, all kinds of discrimination. And really, this was the program of the Nazis. So as a member of a minority religion, I'm a Hare Krishna devotee, I'm concerned about the tendency towards Nazi ideas and racial theories now sweeping the United States. I think it's time to speak out. I'm reminded of a famous quote by a man named Martin Niemöller. He was a Protestant minister during the 1940s, and Niemöller had some qualms about the Nazi program, but he didn't speak out until it was too late, and he's probably best remembered for this quotation. He said, "First they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left for me." So I know it's dangerous to speak out. Speech has consequences. We speak out at our own peril. When I was a kid in school, there was the Vietnam War. The Americans were busy napalming children in Vietnam. For those of you unfamiliar with napalm, it was a solid form of gasoline developed by Dow Chemical. The gasoline jelly was dropped along with incendiary devices on military targets in Vietnam as part of the bombing campaign called Rolling Thunder. And when burning gasoline jelly was dropped on your skin, there was no way to put it out. You would run around shocked by the flames that consumed you while your friends tried to put you out. But the jelly would stick to your skin, and the gasoline fire resisted water. During those days, most people didn't speak out against the Vietnam War. Even today, it's difficult for people to talk about that. Such talk, we were told, undermined our patriotic effort to spread democracy and save the world. Anyway, it didn't matter if a few children were burned. They were collateral damage. After all, they were inferior human beings who didn't know what was good for them. We were going to educate the world and save the world, make it safe for democracy. They were commies. And anyone who said otherwise was a commie sympathizer, or even worse, a hippie. During those days, the anti-war people embraced a commie poet named Yevgeny Yevtushenko. I remember this because I was studying Russian at the time. And he wrote a poem about the Nazi atrocities during the war called Babi Yar. And this was translated by a man named Benjamin Okopnik. It was translated into English. And he has a little introduction. I'll read the poem. So, the idea of reading this poem is to remind people about what the Nazis did. What were they about, really? And they're not about helping the common man. They're not about lifting up the oppressed or the suffering. They're interested in destruction. So here's the note by Benjamin Okopnik. He says, Yevgeny Yevtushenko's poem, written to expose the inhumanity of Babi Yar and the subsequent injustice of the government's refusal to raise a monument to the thousands of Jews executed there by the Nazi troops, produced a tremendous effect in Russia. I learned this poem by heart when I was very young, without understanding anything except the basic ideas. Recently I saw a copy of it and remembered. I still cannot read it without tears. So that's the note by the translator, Benjamin Okopnik. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the story, Babi Yar is a place in Ukraine near Kiev where thousands of Jews were rounded up near a ravine, and they were made to strip naked and stand on the edge of the ravine as stormtroopers gunned them down with machine guns and pushed them over the edge into the ravine. So the story of Babi Yar was commemorated in a poem by Yevgeny Yevtushenko, and I'll read some of this. It's not too long. Babi Yar by Yevgeny Yevtushenko, translated by Benjamin Okopnik. No monument stands over Babi Yar, a steep cliff only, like the rudest headstone. I am afraid. Today I am as old as the entire Jewish race itself. I see myself, an ancient Israelite. I wander over the roads of ancient Egypt, and here, upon the cross, I perished, tortured, and even now I bear the marks of nails. It seems to me that Dreyfus is myself. The Philistines betrayed me, and now judge. I'm in a cage, surrounded and trapped. I'm persecuted, spat on, slandered, and the dainty doilies in their Brussels frills squeal as they stab umbrellas at my face. I see myself a boy in Belostok. Blood spills and runs upon the floors. The chiefs of bars and pub rage unimpeded and reek of vodka and onion, half and half. I'm thrown back by a boot. I have no strength left. In vain I beg the rabble of pogrom to jeers of kill the Jews and save our Russia. My mother's being beaten by a clerk. O Russia of my heart, I know that you are international by inner nature, but often those whose hands are steeped in filth abused your purest name and name of hatred. I know the kindness of my native land, how vile that without the slightest quiver the anti-Semites have proclaimed themselves the union of the Russian people. It seems to me that I am Anna Frank, transparent as the thinnest branch in April, and I'm in love and have no need of phrases, but only that we gaze into each other's eyes. How little one can see or even sense. Leaves are forbidden, so is sky, but much is still allowed, and very gently in darkened rooms each other to embrace. They come! No, fear not. Those are sounds of spring itself. She's coming soon. Quickly, your lips. They break the door. No, river ice is breaking. Wild grasses rustle over Babi Yar. The trees look sternly, as a passing judgment. Here, silently, all screams, and hat in hand, I feel my hair changing shade to grey, and I myself, like one long, soundless scream above the thousands of thousands interred, I'm every man executed here, as I'm every child murdered here. No fibre of my body will forget this. May Internationale thunder and ring when for all time is buried and forgotten, the last of anti-Semites on this earth. There is no Jewish blood that's blood of mine, but hated with a passion that's corrosive am I by anti-Semites like a Jew, and that is why I call myself a Russian. Babi Yar. Nad bivim yarum pamyatnikov niet, Krutoy obriv kak gruboye, nad grobye. Мне страшно, мне сегодня столько лет, как самому еврейскому народу. Меня кажется сейчас я едю. Well, I can't really read in Russian. I'm trying, but we'll come back to this another time. Anyways, that was my attempt to try to live stream something. We'll see how it goes. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.